Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We'll get started in a minute or two. All right, looks like it's slowing down, so we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Q3 Economic Update webinar with Dr. Kuehl, and hosted by AWFS. Couple housekeeping tips before we get started. Please post any questions you have in the chat, and we'll have a brief time for question and answer at the end. And Dr. Kuehl is always kind enough to share his contact info if you want to follow up with him as well. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared after the session, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kuehl. He's the Managing Director and Co-founder of Armada Corporate Intelligence. He provides forecasts and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients around the world. He's the chief economist for several national and international organizations. Prior to starting Armada in 1999, he was a professor of economics and finance for 15 years, teaching in the US, Hungary, Russia, Estonia, Singapore, and Taiwan. He holds advanced degrees in economics, Soviet studies, and East Asian studies. Chris is the co-author of The Flagship and The Strategic Intelligence System, both publications from Armada. He's also responsible for Fabrinomics from the FMA and the advisor for ASA. Dr. Kuehl, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll go ahead and let you take it from here.
All right, very good. I'll share my exciting screen here, and here we go. So, miracles of modern technology. Ta-da! So, the title of this was Three Things to Still Worry About. So, I guess it would be spiders, door-to-door salesmen. No, we'll try to focus more on economic stuff. To be honest, there really isn't a lot to immediately be worried about. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of an explanation of why it is that we economists have been missing it for almost a year. We keep saying that there's going to be a recession. We keep saying it's any minute now. We were predicting it last year. We thought it would hit third quarter. It didn't. We grew at 2.6. We thought it would hit in the fourth quarter. It didn't. We grew at 2.9. We thought it would hit in the first quarter of this year. It didn't. We grew at 2.4. Second quarter for sure. No, it grew at 2.4. Currently, the Atlanta Fed, through the GDP Now study, is saying the third quarter is on track for 3% growth. So, what's going on? Why is it that we keep missing this? So I'll talk a little bit about why we keep dodging the bullet and whether we're going to keep dodging the bullet. But part of the reason for this is that we are a huge country, and I'm sort of starting with this to kind of reiterate what we already know. We're the world's largest economy. We have been for decades, really since the end of the Second World War, if you want to get right down to it. It was not that many years ago that you heard people say, oh, well, China's catching up and China is going to be the biggest economy and the US is falling behind. No one's saying that now. No one at all is saying that now. China is much slower than it was even 2-3 years ago and is losing ground to the United States with every passing month. I mean, China is incurring property sector collapse. They've got youth unemployment of almost 20%. I mean, we could go on for days, and I'll talk a little bit more about China later. But the point is, we're huge. And if you look at the United States and you look at the states, every single state corresponds to a country when it comes to GDP. So you're literally looking at 50 nations from an economic perspective. What that translates into is that the US really never hits a 100% recession. We are always encountering sector recessions. One part of the country will be slower than another. Even industry will be slower than another. We rarely get a circumstance where everything is bad all at once. So you can pick out your state and you can say, gosh, we correspond to the United Arab Emirates or Poland or South Korea. My own state, I'm from Kansas, compares to Ukraine. And you wouldn't believe how appropriate that is, because part of the issue in Ukraine is Eastern Ukrainians don't like Western Ukrainians, and there's a huge culture difference between the two. You have the same thing in Kansas. Eastern Kansans don't like Western Kansans. Western Kansans don't like Eastern Kansans. Western Kansas has tried 5 times to secede and become its own state. Therefore, we get it, I mean, there's major, it even extends to football. If you ever drive through Kansas, which if you're going to go skiing in Denver and you live in Missouri, you have to. But you'll notice when you get to the middle of the state, suddenly no Chiefs fans. They start supporting Denver. And you get further west in Kansas, and it's like, oh, we don't pay any attention at all to Kansas City. It's easier to do business in Denver. We fly out of Denver. We do business in Denver. And they're supporting the Broncos. Ah, see where that's gotten you. So anyway, we are a multifaceted economy, lots of different drivers, and we'll talk a little about some of these as we go. So here were some of the predictions that we were looking at over the last couple of years. I mean, even with some of the revisions that were taking place last year about 2023, we still missed. I mean, Q3, okay, we finally kind of got that right. But Q4, we came in a point and a half better than had been predicted. We have certainly been doing better in 2024. So what was it that was causing all this change? Last year, a lot of what was driving Q3 was manufacturing. We are a manufacturing nation, and I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to beat it to death again, but manufacturing is 20% of our exports, I'm sorry, exports are 20% of our GDP, and manufacturing is over 60% of that export volume. What we make is expensive. What we make is road building equipment and mining equipment and airplanes and railroad engines. We make sophisticated, expensive things. We still account for 40% of the value of global manufacturing. Therefore, our export activity is very closely connected to the value of the dollar. When the dollar is lower, which it was in Q3 of last year, you get more exports. The countries that buy that stuff, the companies that buy that stuff, wait for that advantage. So if you fast forward to Q1 and Q2 of this year, Q1 was a certain amount of export activity done as well. Q2 was driven by consumers. Consumers reacted to spring the way they have in previous years. They spent more on clothing, they spent more on outdoor activities. A lot of the driver for Q2 and Q3, for that matter, was travel and entertainment and people taking vacations again and doing all the things that they hadn't done for a couple of years because of the pandemic. Now, we recovered for the most part from the pandemic by 2021, 2022. So when you go back and you look at numbers for the last few years, there's virtually nothing you can compare to 2020. That was one of the most bizarre recessions we've ever been through. 2021 was equally bizarre because we were coming out of that 2020 strangeness and we were just absolutely pent-up demand took over. By 2022 and 2023, we began to sort of settle back into a bit of a pattern, but there were some fundamental changes that took place. And we'll talk more about these because they have a lot to do with construction, a lot to do with the industry that's affected, and a lot to do with members of AWFS. So we'll talk about that as we go. So the bottom line up front, just to get stuff out of the way, GDP is still running at over 3%. We are not yet heading in even a mild downturn direction. That is going to have an impact on things like Fed decisions, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when you're still growing at 3%, it gives the central bank, the Fed, the latitude to keep trying to control the economy. They can keep raising rates because they haven't seen a response that would reverse their decision making. Central banks have a mantra, and it's the same no matter where they are in the world. We raise rates until we break something. Once we've broken it, we start lowering rates to fix what it was we broke. And the way they determine that they've broken something is generally employment. So they'll look at things like the unemployment numbers and say, well, if the unemployment numbers start to go up, then we know that we've had an impact on the economy. But they haven't. They haven't gone up here. They haven't gone up in Europe. They haven't gone up in Mexico. They haven't gone up anywhere. We'll talk a lot more about why that's the case, but most of you know full well why that's the case. So we'll get back to that in a minute. So we're still growing. Global growth is still growing. It's not growing as fast as it has in past years. I mean, a decade ago, it was around 5%. 3.5 is slower, but it's not crisis. Even Europe is still growing. I mean, it's not growing very fast. 1.1, 1.5 is not anything to write home about, but it's better than recession. China is still growing, not like it used to. And I mean, a lot like it. I mean, China used to be double digit. I mean, this wasn't that many years ago. Then China was 10%, 11%, 12% growth. It's half that now, and not sure it's even going to hit 5%. So the Fed is still likely to raise rates by at least another quarter point, probably in November. And we'll talk a little bit about what's driving some of that inflation concern. You're still seeing a lot of positive economic activity, strong non-residential construction. Caveat here, though, is that most of this growth is based on projects that are already nearing completion. If you talk to people in construction, their concern is next year. They're not seeing a lot in the pipeline. So they're finishing off stuff now. They're still working pretty consistently now. But they look down the road and say, you know, the stuff that was coming in a year or two ago, it's on hold. It's not necessarily been canceled, but if you look at retail, it's hesitant. If you look at even residential housing, you know, it's okay at the multifamily level, but it's not at the family level, the single family level. So they're seeing a lot of mixed messages as far as next year is concerned. Automotive has been strong. UBW strike may affect that. It may not. We'll talk a little bit more about the strike in a minute, but the automotive sector is being driven predominantly by the fact that the average age of a car in the US now is 12.5 years. This is old as it has ever been for the US fleet. It's significant in a lot of respects because what used to drive automotive is that cars demanded replacement one way or the other. They either just wore out at 150,000 miles or they became embarrassing to own. I mean, you get to a point where your car looks old. It's no longer like the new models, and you know, cars represent our status and all that. Except for the last 10 years. In the first place, cars last longer. So 150,000 miles does not mean that your car is no longer functional, and they don't change. So a 10-year-old SUV looks like a 2-month-old SUV. They all look the same. They're still the same strength. They're still the same. You know, it's not obvious that you're driving an antiquated vehicle. Now, most of the changes that are taking place in the new automobile, they're internal. And half the time, they're more irritating than motivating. I mean, I end up in a lot of rental cars, and these drive me nuts. I mean, I call it the mother-in-law edition. I mean, this car talking to me constantly and giving me information I do not want. I mean, I get into the car. There's something in the back seat. There's something in the back seat. It might be a child. It's a suitcase, okay? It's not a child. Calm down. You're next to another car. You're next to another car. Oh my God, I'm parking. I'm not allowed to be 10 car lengths away in a parking lot. Would you chill? You're crossing the center line. Oh my God, yeah, I don't really want to hit the car in front of me. I need to be in a different lane. I mean, it's just this constant. We work a lot with car dealers, and they've been telling us that the number one thing new car buyers request is for all that stuff to be disconnected. It's like, if I want somebody to help me drive the car, I'll pick them out myself. Defense sector is growing, and we know why. I mean, we are spending a great deal of money supporting Ukraine. But bear in mind that 93% of the money that we're spending on Ukraine never leaves the United States. We're not sending troops. We're not paying Ukrainian troops. We're not paying them to do anything. We're arms dealers. We're sending them weapons. And I work a lot with the military, and the military is basically saying, look, the dirty little secret here is that we're not too upset about this because we're getting rid of all the old stuff, which allows us to buy new stuff. We're even testing weapon systems that we didn't know for sure worked because we couldn't really test them. So now we can, and oh my goodness, they work. Yay. So we're actually making quite a bit of money, the civilian sector, because of the way we're organized. The military doesn't build its own stuff. It buys it from civilian producers. And that's the military industrial complex we've heard about for 100 years. So we're seeing quite a few growth areas. It does not necessarily counter the areas that aren't growing. We're still seeing distress in single family home construction, something that is affecting the AWFS member because that's where a lot of that material goes. But it isn't dead, it's just sector driven. You've still got parts of the country that are growing, but you've got other parts of the country that have stopped growing or are even reversing. You're seeing a little bit of distress in certain kinds of retail. And we'll talk more about some of the retail shifting in a minute. But point is that there are definitely strong parts of the economy still growing. Briefly, and because a lot of you do business with and around Mexico, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Mexico. I normally don't, but there's some interesting developments there. First off, it's growing even faster than we are, 5.4%. Industrial production is up. The significance of manufacturing has really increased in Mexico. There are just some interesting developments related to the supply chain, related to worker shortage, related to a lot of other things. Mexico now is the leading provider of imports into the United States. They have replaced China. We now import more from Mexico than we do from China. And if you look at the chart, Chinese participation is dropping like a stone, and Mexico is rising in direct proportion to it. The retail sales in Mexico have been strong, up by 3.5%. All of this business in Mexico has been bolstering their middle class. And Mexico is going to be going through an election next year that's going to be historic, no matter what happens. Mexico will have a female president next year, regardless. The two candidates for the two major parties, the two that will be fighting this out next year, both women. The current party, which is AMLO's party, Manuel Lopez Obrador, his successor, because he can't run for another term, is currently the mayor of Mexico City and an ally of his, more of a technocrat, more of an economic oriented person, and also somebody who wants to get along better with the US. Her opponent, who's representing the PAN party, which is the Northern Mexican pro-business party, her husband is an indigenous Mexican. He's from the native population. She's very charismatic, another technocrat, another person oriented towards business and the United States. So one way or the other, Mexico is going to have a technocrat, a woman, somebody a little more oriented towards the US, regardless of which of these two win. So these next few slides are things that Armada does. I've shown these before. I'm just going to go over them real quick. When you look at overall industrial activity, we're seeing growth still over our normal trend line. We'll probably see a bit of a decline going into the beginning of next year. And the reason for that is not that there is a significant economic downturn, it's just that companies overbought. One of the big issues for the economy now is that companies reacted to the supply chain by buying more inventory than they ever had before. I work a lot with credit managers, and one of the things they've noted the last couple of years is that almost every one of their clients has been buying way more inventory than they ever used to. And when they were asked why, they said, well, we can't trust the supply chain anymore. We got caught so many times the last couple of years where we have a project, we have a machine, we have something almost ready. All we need is a couple parts, which we can't get. And until we get the part, we can't ship it. I mean, we went through that with automotive. It's like, well, it's all done except for the chip that starts the car. Sure wish we had that because funny thing, car buyers want a car that starts. So as companies kept facing those supply chain crises, they compensated or overcompensated by buying more stuff. If you look at construction spending in general, which is obviously something that is of great concern to your sector, look at that growth chart. I mean, that's nearly exponential. I mean, that's been going up and up and up and up since the recession of 2008. And even with a little bit of a decline, it's still way above trend line. So we continue to see non-residential construction growing at a pretty respectable rate. It's being driven by logistics and supply chain work. It's being driven by manufacturing. The fastest growing sector of commercial construction now is manufacturing. It's up 73% from what it was last year. And we know why. I mean, it's companies reshoring, it's companies reacting to all the inventory they're holding. Companies now have to have more storage. And so they're building it. They're building the inventory that they either need or think they're going to need, and they need a space for it. The fact that we're moving towards robotics and technology changes what you have to have in your facility. I mean, I talked to a lot of manufacturers that said, for years we could get away with some nasty cinder block building, which was unair conditioned and it was dirty. It's just the way things is. It's manufacturing. But then they bring in the robot, and the robot goes, oh no, oh no, no, no. I'm not going to work under these conditions. No, I'm not. I'm run by a computer. Computers don't like hot. Computers don't like humidity. Computers don't like dirty. You guys may tolerate dust. We don't. If it gets where we don't want it, we just stop. So unless you fix this building, we're going to fail at like every opportunity. So the manufacturers have got to upgrade their buildings to accommodate the robots and the computers. The people, what the heck? You guys worked in this mess for 4 decades. And they're like, really? You're upgrading the building because the robots don't like it. Well, it's the robot apocalypse. You're just going to have to get used to it. If you look at the trends just for the manufacturing sector, kind of not the industrial economy as a whole, really mimics it. We're going to see still growth towards the end of this year and the beginning of next. Then that inventory build catches up. Because the problem with all that inventory is it screws up the reorder cycle. Companies are not going to be shipping because their clients already have stuff and they're not going to start buying until they blow through some of that inventory. Machinery is big in this industry as well. Machinery is very sensitive to the capacity utilization numbers. And I've talked about these before, but they're pretty simple. The ideal place to be with capacity is between 80 and 85%. If you are under 80% utilization, you have too much slack. You've got machines that aren't working to their capability. You have people that are not as productive as they could be. over 85%, now you're dealing with bottlenecks and shortages, and that's when you start buying the machines and hiring new people. Currently, the capacity numbers are right almost at 80. They've been running at like 79.6 or 78.9. A couple of times in the last year, they've poked above 80 for a month or two. They're not anywhere near 85 yet. They're not yet where it would trigger people to do buying, but they're almost to the point of normal. And that will at least allow some stability in the machinery sector. And since a lot of AWFS members are essentially machinery makers or machinery buyers, this is a sector that a lot about. So a few slides about Mexico, and then we'll move on to other stuff. I'll blow through these pretty quick. Basically, month after month, growth has been significant. Look at the share that manufacturing plays in Mexico. As far as their exports are concerned, it's overwhelmingly what they rely on. Oil used to be half, and it's now 5.4. Agriculture used to be 20%, 25%, 5.4. I mean, oil and ag used to be half of what Mexico exported. Now look, I mean, it's barely 10%. Most of what comes out of Mexico is manufactured. Retail sales are up. If the Mexican economy is growing, then people have money, they have jobs, and they're more likely to go out and spend. Remittances are down. You've got more people in Mexico working in Mexico. They don't have to come into the U.S. Immigration has changed dramatically in the last several years. We have never had fewer people coming from Mexico. Our immigration rates are higher. They're not Mexican. They're coming from Latin America. They're coming from Central America. The single biggest contributor to illegal immigration into the United States for the last year has been Venezuela. And those people are not as much migrants looking for work as they're refugees trying to escape a country that is in collapse. I mean, I was having a conversation with a guy putting in a sprinkler system. And I said, so where are you from? He goes, Venezuela. What are you doing here? Working illegally. He said, oh, why? He says, I'm an accountant. I used to have my own business in Caracas. I made nice money as an accountant in Caracas, but I made the mistake of criticizing that nut job Maduro, and I had to get the heck out of Venezuela. If I go back home, I'll be shot. He said, didn't your country used to have people that took out people like Maduro? Why would you not do that? If you would kill that guy, I'd go back home. So you have an awful lot of people that are here really much more temporarily than previous immigrant waves. I mean, when the Mexican people were coming across, they were either starting a new life trying to work here, or they were working here and going back and forth, going back home, spend the money they made, go back to the U.S. You know, the refugees from Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras fleeing drug gangs, they want to go home as soon as they could if things would calm down. But that's changing the whole immigration pattern. Employment has gone up in Mexico. It's hard to count employment in Mexico because almost half the population is not in the system. So it's hard to tell if they're employed or unemployed because they're essentially kind of subsistence living in more rural parts of Mexico. Peso has gained. It is way up from what it was in 2020, kind of back to where it's been for the last 10, 15 years. So it's a little bit more conducive for the Mexican economy. Inflation has come down, both at the core and non-core, still higher than it is in the US by quite a bit, but a drop from that peak that it reached in 2021 and 2022. And even foreign debt's going down. The amount of foreign-owned government debt is dropping and dropping pretty quickly. That's not something we can say in the U.S., by the way. So we were seeing Mexico get a little bit more control over its finances. So briefly about the UAW, it doesn't have as much of an impact on AWFS members as maybe other sectors, but Every 10 days, this strike costs $6 billion. So that accumulates pretty quick, and pretty soon it begins to pull down overall GDP growth. The real issue with this strike is not so much wages. The wages and the benefits and all that, that's been getting the headlines. But that's usually a negotiating position. It's kind of like you throw something out and then you negotiate down from it and presumably get more than you would have if you'd asked whatever. The real issue is job security. You see a lot of shifting in Mexico, as I mentioned, the manufacturing sector. As soon as the UAW announced that it was going to do this kind of strike activity, you immediately saw 5 major investments in automotive manufacturing in Mexico, literally that day. I mean, it was investors and companies saying, hey, we know what's going to happen with this strike, so let's put more money into Mexico. The other significant development, and this is maybe a month ago, the Biden administration went to meet with Japan and South Korea. The idea was that we wanted to get Japan and South Korea to cooperate with us to counter China. Now, there's no problem with us working with Japan, no problem with us working with South Korea. The issue is getting them to work with each other. They hate each other with a passion. This is a 2,500-year-old wrangle. Japan used to occupy South Korea. When they occupied South Korea, they forbade the Korean language. I mean, there's a lot of hard feelings between the two. So we came and said, we want you guys to get along with each other and work with us. And they said, what's in it for us? And our response was, how about if we offered your auto sector a lot more access to the US? And the South Koreans and the Japanese said, oh, okay, that makes sense. So we're on the cusp of making it a lot easier for Kia and Hyundai and Toyota and Honda and Suzuki and whoever else to bring their vehicles and their parts into the US. That worries the UAW because they're fully aware that production in the United States has declined. The American consumer is a lot more interested in other than the big 3 brands, because the big 3 in the US are not the big 3 internationally. Big 3 globally, Volkswagen, Toyota, Nissan. So there's a lot of sort of under the radar conversation. But when it comes to things like wages, you can see the orientation of the producers. I mean, hourly wage in Mexico is $12. Hourly wage in China is less than 4. So if you're talking 60, 70, $80 an hour wages here, that kind of pushes people out of the US. We're talking about inventory. I've already mentioned it. We don't have many companies that think they have too little inventory. We have many who think they have too much. Job openings have begun to decline, but not because we're hiring. It's because companies have quit looking. They can't find people anyway, so what's the point? And we're seeing a lot of these job applications being withdrawn. And companies are like, look, the way we're hiring now is by poaching each other. So rather than hiring somebody that is coming out of a non-existent pipeline, we're just hiring somebody else's employee, which drives up wages. Because if you're going to hire somebody who's already working, you're going to have to make an incentive. You're going to have to pay them more. And you're probably going to have to pay your own people more to keep them from being poached. As mentioned, the Fed's still fighting inflation, still has reason to think there's room. 2 ways that we measure inflation. I've talked about this before too, but the consumer price index is not what the Fed pays attention to because it's a little artificial. The CPI is based on a basket of goods that a typical family of 4 buys. There are some critical assumptions here. Number one, is there really a typical family of 4? And the answer to that is no. We have boomers and Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Z, and they don't spend the same. Their baskets don't look alike. So your basket isn't going to be as accurate as you would like it to be. So the Fed doesn't like the CPI. The Fed looks at PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures. This is what we actually bought and what it actually cost us. Great data, much more accurate, but because it is accurate and current, it takes a while to collect it. So it lags. The Fed is just now looking at June data. So they don't know what inflation was in July, August, or September because they're still dealing with June data. And so they lag by about a quarter. So maybe inflation came down further than they thought. We won't know for a month or so. We have to process the new data. We do know that inflation is falling, and it is falling predominantly in sort of the non-core areas, but it's also falling in some of the core areas. But for those who have any sort of memory, I can't see you all, but I'm assuming that some of you are my vintage. You were around in the 80s and you remember the 80s, and you might remember Paul Volcker, who decided that it was his mission. Well, he didn't decide, it was his mission. That's why he was brought in. Control inflation. And he said, yep, there's one way to control inflation. You beat the economy to death with a baseball bat. Raise rates 20 points, and by God, that'll kill her. Because if you raise rates that high, businesses can't cope. They're going to start laying people off. They certainly won't be hiring. If people are laid off, they don't make any money. If they don't make any money, they can't spend any money. And if people can't spend any money, then they can't raise prices, can they? That's the end of inflation. Thank you. But Uncle Paul, that's going to give us recession. Yep, pretty much guaranteed. 3 to 5 years, maybe 10, maybe 20. Heck, you may never get out of it. Problem. You brought me in to deal with inflation. I dealt with it. What you do about recession, that's somebody else's problem. Point, our rates getting up to 5.5 takes us back to where we've been historically. We have rarely been anywhere near where we were for a decade when rates were zero. As a matter of fact, you can't get to a point where rates were zero, even if you take this chart back to the turn of the century. We will never see that again. We are never going to see rates that low because it was a headache. It was a disaster. It created more problems than it solved. The good news, sort of silver lining to have rates up about 5.5%, is that when the Fed decides to start stimulating, it can. Remember when the Fed was trying to stimulate the economy in 2020? How? How do you stimulate the economy when your rates are zero? It's kind of like, well, we're going to encourage people to borrow money by lowering our rates to like really, really zero. They're already zero. Yeah, but it's like double zero. There's no room. But if you decide to stimulate next year and figure out a way to get the economy goosed again, and the rates are 5.5, you can cut them by a point or two and get people's attention because all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is great. The rates have come down. Loans are easier. I can buy a home. I can do all kinds of stuff. So the good news is that the Fed now has something to work with next year, should they decide to do that. Banks are tightening credit standards. You're running into that. It's affecting construction. And it's important to understand that this also has a bit of a silver lining because banks still have to make loans. That's how they make money. They're now a lot more interested in manufacturing and groups that are looking for tangible things. If you're borrowing money to buy a $500,000 machine, well, the bank looks at this and says, outstanding, that's what we call collateral. So if something goes wrong, we've got something to sell. If you come into my bank and say, hey, the coffee shop next to a Starbucks, you don't let the door hit you on the way out. Go away. There's no protection for a manufacturer. That's a whole different story. The biggest problem construction is running into right now, whether it's industrial or residential, is no longer workforce, it's no longer materials, though those haven't gone away. There's still issues. But now the issue, according to the surveys, is available of financing. So companies are finding ways to get around some of the workforce limitations. Like I said, there's still issues, but the number one issue is financing. Mentioned this before, I promise not to beat it to death. 65% of the marketplace is overstocked. Until that reduces, until that inventory disappears, you're not going to see a lot of reordering. So one of the things that's unique of the many in our economy is the way consumers react to bad economic news. Every other country in the world, if the consumer is told things are going to get rough, potential for recession, things are not, downturn for sure, they get cautious. Japanese, Chinese, Europeans, they start saving. They start worrying about their job. They start cutting back on spending. We don't. Our attitude is, well, there's inflation. Therefore, things are going to get more expensive. So I better buy now. And I might lose my job later. Then I can't buy anything. So I better buy now while I still have a job and the prices are lower. So our reaction to economic stress in the future is to buy. So here we are looking at the potential for a downturn, and we're way above trend line. We're actually growing. And it's so characteristic of the U.S. consumer. It's what motivates the kind of things that you see when there's a stimulus period. Remember in 2020, when we're hitting a recession, a manufactured recession by edict, weird as it could possibly be, and our response was to throw money at the consumer and hope that they would spend their way out of it. Somehow the powers that be never quite figured out that if you throw money at consumers and then close everything that they would spend their money on, you're not going to get much stimulus. So the consumer is like, yay, thank you for the money, but I can't buy anything. I can't travel. I can't go out to eat. I can't, all the events have been canceled. I can't even be within 30 feet of my own relatives. So what am I supposed to do with this money? We ended up saving it. We had about a 6% savings rate until that period, and it suddenly became a 38% savings rate. And that has been a lot of what's been driving the economy the last couple of years, is all of this accumulated money coming out later, not in 2020 when it was supposed to, but in 2021 and 2022, because we couldn't spend it in 2020 as much as we wanted to, as system was closed. Expectations for housing has come, or for spending has come down, but it's still basically what you're seeing is the expectation levels that peak with the post-pandemic act. But we're now back to numbers that are still higher than we've seen going back to 2013, 2012. It goes back a long time. We've blown through most of that accumulated savings. However, only the bottom thirds. The upper third is still sitting on a lot of money, probably 1.7 to $2 trillion. Most of that money ended up in some kind of savings or investment. Those people who were in the upper third of income earners put their money into what's referred to as the shadow banking system, kind of a sinister name for what is really non-financial or non, I'm trying to think how the Fed characterizes it. It's basically financial institutions the Fed does not have control over. So it's going to be equity funds and venture funds and angel funds and insurance companies and captive lenders, all kinds of groups that are not under the purview of the Fed. They're still spending money. And a lot of that money that was accumulated by the upper third ended up in those funds. So you take, for example, a captive lender like GMAC. When the Fed was trying to control and still is trying to control the amount of money going into the economy, it reached out to GMAC and said, would you guys quit making so many car loans? And GMAC said, do you know what the GM stands for in our name? That would be General Motors. Do you know what General Motors does? General Motors makes cars. Our job in GMAC is to get people to buy cars by loaning them money. So I understand, Mr. Fed, that you want to slow down the money supply, and I understand you're trying to control banks. Do not ask us to tank our industry to help you do that. Our job is to get people in cars. So you have a number of organizations that are kind of in that world. They function somewhat similarly to a bank in some respect, but they're not under the control of the Fed. Currently, credit card debt in the United States among consumers is $7 trillion. Total consumer debt, which includes mortgages and cars and all the rest, $70 trillion. So there's an awful lot of money that's still sloshing around the economy. E-commerce keeps going up. It's been having an impact on your sector, but in interesting ways. Part of what's been driving the activity around e-commerce is that it's requiring a lot more warehouse development, a lot more logistics, et cetera. It's 84% higher than it was pre-pandemic. People who hadn't experienced e-commerce were now experiencing it. But there are some interesting changes just starting to show up, and nobody quite yet has quantified these, but so it's more anecdotal than anything else. Last week, I was in Greenville, South Carolina, and getting the full scoop on how Greenville had transformed itself. That 10, 15 years ago, downtown Greenville was a ghost town. Everybody had left. It was high crime. There was no business left there. In the last 10 or 15 years, complete reversal. Downtown Greenville has 56 restaurants. And part of what's been driving this is the Gen Z. The Gen Z generation is kind of orienting almost towards a European lifestyle when it comes to how they live and work. And I don't want to belabor this or go into excruciating detail, but just as an example of kind of the European approach, when I was teaching in Hungary years ago, there's a very famous street, center of Budapest, called the Váci utca. And at the very end of that is a huge coffee shop called Gerbo. It's seating for like 300 people. And it's a coffee shop. I mean, it's just coffee and pastries. That's it. But the pattern in Budapest is that you hang out at Gerbo all day, and everybody you need to see at some point will wander through that coffee shop. So you don't even need to make appointments. You don't put people in your office. You just kind of hang out all day and wait for people to come by. What I saw in Greenville was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the streets are full. I mean, people are out and walking around, going to restaurants. I could tell they were shopping like Europeans. They had little bags with a few items in it. I mean, they weren't doing the Costco Sam's Club thing. That's a suburban approach. I mean, that's the boomer. That's the Gen X that goes and shops like they're doomsday preppers and, buys 900 rolls of paper towels because, gosh, you never know when you're going to need 900 rolls of paper towels. The Gen Z is more, I'm going to live in a loft. I'm going to have the things that I need handy. I don't like to cook. I don't want to mow a yard. I don't want to do any of those things. I'm just going to kind of have this existence where I hang out of my apartment more than I'm in it. And that affects a lot of things. It affects what's in that apartment. It affects the kind of business that's going to be around the area. It's even affecting automotive. Gen Z is spectacularly uninterested in owning a car. The when I was 16, when I was 15, I was lying about my age trying to get a driver's license. You now have a situation where 20% of Gen Z have reached the age of 21 and do not have a driver's license. They have not felt the need. They don't have a car. They don't need one. They use Lyft and they use Uber or they walk or they use a bike. That's affecting e-commerce a little bit. It's just starting to. The Gen Z is more interested in local, going to be somewhat idiosyncratic. Some parts of the country are going to see more of it than others, but it's a trend that bears watching. The single most effective slide arguing against the recession is this one. We're still seeing a lot of capital spending, and it's mostly around robotics, automation, technology. Companies are having to substitute. When they don't find the workers that they need, they're bringing in equipment. New orders for durable goods, computers looking good, electrical looking good, automotive still growing, the defense sector. Weak sectors have tended to be those that are communications oriented, et cetera. But if you look at the sectors that most affect you, they're still growing. They're still growing at a pretty decent clip. We are similar to the rest of the world when it comes to things like our manufacturing sector. 19 countries are still in contraction as far as this survey is concerned. This is the Purchasing Managers Index, and I've talked about it before, but it's one of the more reliable tools because A, it's easy to understand. Anything over 50 is expansion, anything under 50 is contraction. B, it's accurate because purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. Many surveys are manipulated. People are trying to get a certain outcome. The purchasing manager is asked, are you buying more or less steel? Are you buying more or less cabinetry? Are you buying more or less anything? And their response is usually, well, more. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. Somebody told me to buy more of this stuff and run out of toilet paper. I'm the purchasing manager, man. I don't know why I do anything. I just buy what people tell me to buy. I'm not going to question my CFO and say, sir, why are we buying more of this? Shut up, Binkley, and do your job. It's like, just buy it, just find a good price. So it's accurate. It just is. They're buying more and buying less. The U.S. is currently just a little under that 50 line. We're not in desperate shape yet. Mexico is still above it. India is way above it. The one thing you can't trust in this is the Russian number, because Russia's original numbers came in the 30s, and then they were suddenly withdrawn, and new numbers came out in the 50s, and the people that submitted the first set of numbers vanished. So when you ask the second set of miners, how come the numbers went up? Because Vladimir said if numbers don't go up, I'm going to be in a plane that doesn't land correctly. So Russia hasn't changed from what it used to be. As many of you know, I started out as a Soviet specialist back in the 80s. I'm still a Cold War. Still trust that country as far as I can throw it. We are back on track when it comes to fuel. We're the world's biggest oil producer. We're oil consumer, world's biggest oil exporter. So we're capable of getting up around 14 to 15 million barrels a day. We're currently right around 13. We have a gap which we make up by buying it from Canada and Mexico. Recently, OPEC talked about continuing to cut production, and this has caused oil per barrel prices to jump up into the 80s, but they're starting to fade already because the U.S. reacted, as one would expect, and said, okay, fine, if you're cutting production, we'll up ours. And so you're getting more activity coming out of Texas and Oklahoma and North Dakota, elsewhere, as the world price per barrel changes. We still expect the per barrel price to be in kind of the high 70s, low 80s going into next year. We saw prices go up considerably, but they're now starting to fall back down again. Always a lot of volatility when it comes to fuel. And the transportation sector as a whole has kind of come back to semi-normal. We had 65,000 new trucking companies come into existence last year. This was in reaction to the fact that there were 14 loads to truck. Many of you remember last year you couldn't get a truck. You had difficulty getting stuff in and you had difficulty getting it out. That's now become a lot less concerning. It's 2.7 loads per truck. So we're back closer to normal because of that 65,000 group. It's the easiest industry in the world to get into. If you want to suddenly be a trucker and you ask, what do I need? Trucker. A truck. And if you have a truck and you have a commercial driving license, you're a trucker. And suddenly the roads are full of mama you betcha's real good trucking. And they will leave the industry as fast as they came in once the money is not there. So it's beginning to see some hemorrhaging. 2.7 loads per truck isn't as lucrative as 14 loads per truck. Baltic Dry, I throw this in just because it's fun. This is the oldest index in economics. This goes all the way back to the 1700s, and it tracks commodities being shipped by ocean carrier. So when you see these numbers go up, it means that commodities are moving. And we had a big surge right after the pandemic restrictions fell down. It's now starting to come back up and becomes a real indicator of commodity movement. And it affects things that are important to your industry, like lumber. A lot of that stuff is shipped by ocean. So with that, I'm going to hush up. This is not one of my cats, but it looks like one. And those of you who are just gluttons for information, you already get a version of the flagship from AWFS. You usually get part of our or all of our Monday edition. If you want the whole thing and you want to be bored out of your mind on Wednesdays and Fridays too, feel free. You can let me know. I'll put you on the trial list, and if you decide you want your very own, it is the same as 2 Starbucks caramel macchiatos, so it's not terribly expensive. And then the watch is the one that I showed you in the beginning that had all the charts and graphs. The fun thing about the watch is the guy that designed that for us and has given us our remarkable accuracy is a retired lieutenant colonel who used to be in the artillery. And he pointed out that in his previous life, accuracy was really, really, really important. And as a result, he developed a very, very sophisticated system, which he has now adapted to the industrial sector. So we get this 99% accuracy quarter after quarter. With that, I'm going to shut up just in case there's a question. Those of you who want to send me one later, just remember, I am as long-winded in print as I am in public. So back to you, Adria, in the studio.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kuehl. That was awesome as always. Got a lot of good tidbits this time. I was especially interested in the Gen Z behavioral shifts with community and that sort of thing. That's really interesting. So yeah, we do have time maybe for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has anything, go ahead and post them in the chat. While we're waiting for that, Dr. Kuehl mentioned the flagship report and that we, through AWFS, we offer our members the Monday edition. So like he said, they put it out 3 times a week and we make it available to our members for free on Mondays. So if you're not already receiving the flagship report, you can click on that QR code or go to that bit.ly link that's here on the screen and get yourself signed up for that.
Very good. And I saved the best stuff for Monday. I just, I told Adria that before, Wednesday and Friday, by the time it gets around to Friday, I'm like, it's the weekend. Who needs to be depressed now? So
there you go. Yep, it is. It's always full of lots of really good stuff. Excuse me. So let's see. I'm not seeing any questions come through. I do want to thank everyone for joining us. If you could take a moment to complete the survey for this webinar, and if you have any suggestions for future other different topics, that's an opportunity for you to share that as well. The next webinar with Dr. Kuehl will be on Wednesday, December 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And you can find the registration link for that on the page that's listed there, awfs.org/webinar/Dr.Chris-Kuehl. Or if you go to our website, awfs.org, and go to education webinars, it's right there. I still don't see any
Good.
questions come through. So if you have any, feel free to reach out to me or Dr. Kuehl directly. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.